and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. I didn't sign up for this as a refrain that my next guests hear a lot about when they're having confidential conversations with today's campus leaders. We know that college athletics is undergoing a substantive transformation, and partially due to COVID and other factors, including demographic shifts across the nation, so is higher education. College presidents are under tremendous pressure to change and reinvent their campuses. Yet what they are often initially hard to do is not what they end up doing. Case in point, Temple University's now former president, Jason Wingard, resigned after just 2 years of campus challenges, many of which were somewhat out of his individual control. My guests today will share some of their insights and general conversations that they have had with university presidents on a daily basis. From managing the board of trustees to dealing with college athletics, the job has never been more challenging. I have invited them back to the podcast because they add significant value to our discussions around leadership in college athletics. Adrienne Lamart is a principal in BakerTilly's risk advisory practice with more than 17 years of professional consulting experiences. She specializes in services to higher education and research institutions, specifically in the area of risk management, fraud, and research compliance. My next guest is Dave Capitano. Dave also provides oversight to more than 200 team members serving over 400 public and private colleges and universities, as he is the firm's higher education practice leader. Dave also has more than 30 years of experience working with college and university leadership and boards in a variety of strategic advisory and accounting areas. He takes a hands-on approach, working collaboratively with institutional leadership to provide guidance and advice to be sustainable and resilient. So Dave and Adrienne, welcome back to the podcast. I feel like I can call you friends of the podcast. I appreciate that you're here today, Dave and Adrienne.
Well, Karen,
thanks for having us.
One of the things that has been a constant in the last couple of years has been change. And normally we think of change as something that happens year over year, but it starts to happen almost week after week in higher education and in college athletics. March Madness has been a great example of that. Nothing's been predictable in this tournament, except maybe South Carolina winning for the women's bracket. But, Dave, you've talked recently a lot about this with some folks in the business offices and other places. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, Karen, I appreciate it. And we do appreciate being back on the podcast. We are big fans, so we love the conversation. We love what you're doing for the industry. So I just got off a tour talking at some of the big associations for the industry, and the overall sentiment is the same. It's a change is coming at us really, really fast in this current environment. And I mentioned to the audience at the last presentation that I had the privilege of representing colleges and universities for over 30 years. And I've seen more change in the last 3 than I saw in the first 27. And I get it. You could argue that these types of things that we're about to talk to with regards to the different disruptors that are out there always exist. But I'm convinced that it's different in this current environment. I am convinced that COVID really changed the landscape of how people are thinking, the level of stress that's out there. And change in itself doesn't necessarily cause people to overly get stressed. But in the current environment, the stress tolerance is a lot less. And we're just seeing a lot of that affecting our leadership. The week doesn't go by that I'm not talking to a president or a chancellor that says, Dave, I'm very passionate about our mission. I love what I'm doing. I'm very committed to the student success, but I didn't sign up for some of this stuff. And it's just really beating me down right now.
Adrienne, what are your thoughts? You've spoken to me about a term that I love, leadership wellness. What are your thoughts on this area?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, so Dave talked a lot about kind of the recent transformation, the rapid transformation, I think, and I think that's right. And the last couple of years, just working in higher ed and risk advisory, there's this real recognition and this real pivot towards being really student focused. I mean, I think higher ed would say we've always been student focused, but I mean, it is acutely student focused. And I think that combined with the rapid change in the student makeup, the demographics, the student psyche, it's really compelled that movement. And I think, as Dave was talking about, I mean, he's constantly on the phone with senior leaders. We've been so focused in on student wellness, right? Student mental health, because that's been a big challenge for a lot of institutions to focus on. I mean, it was something that predated the pandemic. We had been observing kind of these trends and these themes and students coming in needing more help. The pandemic definitely sped it up. But I think what we're seeing now is the burnout amongst the senior leaders. So Dave was talking about, I'm constantly on the phone, with presidents and CFOs and other key individuals. And, I didn't sign up for this. I'm burned out. We focus so much on the students. I don't necessarily think we're equally focusing on the leadership and, shared governance, right? That concept of shared governance, I'm going to apply it to this because we need to equally, I think, take account of that group because they're spearheading, they're leading the strategy, the ship, the industry, so to speak. So yeah, I think it's definitely something we need to pay closer attention to.
So let's say I have a couple of presidents on this call, on this podcast who are listening in and thinking, yeah, that sounds a lot like me. What kinds of advice do you give them? What kinds of strategies can they use to strengthen themselves and strengthen their leadership?
Well, again, excellent question for the audience. So what we're seeing right now is the connection between the leadership and the board, the trustees, the directors, and that connection needs to be stronger than ever. So, I mean, it's probably not the most popular thing to say, but a lot of institutions need to step back and really challenge themselves with regards to that board makeup. Do they have the right people on the board? And the same things that we just talked about with regards to the burnout of the leadership. I mean, think about it. We have a volunteer boards on these institutions. They got day jobs. They got their own pressures existing with all these things that we just talked about. And then they're trying to commit the time and the energy to help these schools. There's an equal level of stress at that level. So really, first step, in my view, is stepping back, really looking at that board, figuring out what the makeup needs to look like. Do we have the right size? Do we have the right complement? Do we have individuals that have the time and energy and skill sets to devote to it? Do we have enough people that could challenge us and that are inquisitive and curious about what's going on in the industry to really be that guiding light for these leadership teams?
I think that's interesting, Dave, but I would add on to it, and it's interesting because, I'm here in Philadelphia. Karen, you're here in Philadelphia. We just had a big shake up at one of our local institutions. There's a president that recently resigned, my alma mater. And I think for the past, recent history, right? Presidents have been brought in to be outward facing, raise funds, raise the profile of the institution. Like Dave was talking about, making sure that they have that good leadership team on the board. I think combined with that now, I think these presidents also need to look back inwards. The same way we're focusing on our students, I think there's a good opportunity to equally come back in, focus on your internal leadership team, focus on your faculty, focus on those relationships, because I think as the case here in Philadelphia continues to kind of unravel and we learn more about that some of the, feedback that individual received, that there wasn't enough time spent with, the internal constituencies. So definitely a balancing act, but I think starting to, turn inward and kind of focus that care on your own colleagues, your own team is going to also be equally important.
So you both bring up great points. So let me first start with boards. Dave, as you know, with boards, they are constructed differently at every institution, public, private, state related, land grant, all the way down to liberal arts. How can presidents, if they're working with a board that is determined for them, that they have very little input into the members that are there, how can they manage that process a little bit better?
Well, I mean, you can always go back to the simple principles of communication. How do we engage with individuals? How do we have a level of transparency with regards to the things that we're dealing with? I think most of the time where we see the hiccups between the leadership and the board is there's too many sidebars with regards to conversations. So you align yourself maybe with one or two trustees that kind of isolate the others. So no matter whether the board's appointed for you or is chosen or however you go about it, I think there's basic principles that allow for transparency and communication. That, supported by a good governance policy, our charter, things that eliminate judgment calls when things get critical. A lot of times we're in situations where we're in the heat of the moment, we're calling the board together and we're making decisions in somewhat crisis mode.
Yeah.
And if we don't have a great sense of our guiding principles and values, we can make calls that don't necessarily align. And that's where we usually see the trouble happen at the end of the day. You end up in a position where you acted a little bit too fast and not in line with some of the past consistent disciplines that you had in decision making.
Let me follow up with you on one question, diving more deeply into athletics. Athletics in particular has been on this racetrack to change, and nobody seems to know how to navigate the ship. And that's something that presidents are being asked to do, to make decisions to govern the direction of NCAA, primarily at the Power 5 level, but even in divisions 2 and 3. I'm starting to see some encouraging signs that presidents are being more aware and involved. How do they leverage their boards in making decisions that are not only best for the institution, but best for the conference they're in as well?
Yeah, and best for the student athletes,
Right?
And all those three constituents. So Karen, I don't know if I have a good answer for you on this one, because it is extremely complicated. I just had the opportunity to speak on NIL and NIL collectives last week at one of the conferences. And just to think about the dynamics between what's existing with conference realignment, the transfer portal, NIL collectives. I mean, the players are much different. TV deals, I mean, the dollars are significant. And one of the biggest concerns that we talked about in challenges is that when those dollars get so large, your viewpoints maybe start to get skewed with regards to those three main constituents, right? You start to think a little bit differently in how you're making decisions. So again, there's no magic to the solution, but there are basic principles that I believe institutions abide by in the other parts of their operations, in part in their financial perspective. When they look at their academic protocols, the same thing should apply to the athletic protocols, and institutions are doing it. I'm not saying that they're not, they clearly are. I just think it gets really, really tricky when you're talking about some of these large dollars. When you get into some of the smaller leagues, it becomes a little bit more pressure between the ability to have that connection with your student athlete, help them mature, help them grow through the process, help them achieve things in life that extend beyond the field or the court. And I believe those coaches and those ADs are really built into that system to not necessarily want to win at the end of the day on the field, but win in life when they're educating and teaching and coaching those students. I think it gets a little blurred as we get higher up in the scale.
And yet that's what the media loves to talk about, right? Is the big dollars, the big decisions, that institutions have to make, trying to keep up with the SEC and the Big Ten and revenue and things like that. Yeah. Adrian, let's talk about presidents a little bit. You've referenced the fact that boards have traditionally hired more externally focused presidents in some of these larger, maybe public stressed institutions because the funding just isn't there. But you also make a compelling argument that presidents need to be inwardly focused as well, so that the faculty feel valued, the staff feel heard, the campus feels safe. All those things make a difference. Have you seen any models out there that might be good for schools to look at and consider?
It's a great question. I mean, Dave and I work with a lot of colleges and universities, and I think they're each unique and responsive to their own environments. If we take a look at the evolution of faculty, and Karen, you're a faculty member, I would imagine you're seeing the same change in the turnover in faculty that we're seeing in our students, right? And I think that going back to that conversation that we talked about wellness a little while ago is, this is kind of the progression of that student group, right? So I think that their expectations as faculty members, as a new faculty member coming into the institutions, is really compelling those presidents to have to rethink about how they manage. It's compelling Dave and I to think about how we manage our new colleagues that are graduating from college and coming into the profession. So I think it's taking an inventory, like you would for anything, of what your unique environment is and what the needs of those individuals are and reflecting it. I don't know if we've seen a model that works because I think everybody's kind of going through it right now. I'll kick it over to Dave and see if he's got anything that he's seen, but I think we're right now. I mean, that's why Dave's getting all the calls he's getting.
Well, Adrian, I'll tell you the one quote that I love and use as much as I can is there's different leaders for different times. And I think, Karen, that's what we're seeing. And no one should ever assume because we're seeing turnover that someone is a bad leader. I mean, there certainly could be, but the situations dictate different types of people. And we all have our strengths with regards to what the situation is and where it is. And I think when we go back to talking about that makeup that about the connection and the makeup of the board to the leadership, just because someone is high on organizational chart doesn't necessarily mean that they need to guide everything. That leadership team is just what it is. It's a team of individuals with different strengths that I am convinced in this current environment, you need to lean on them as much as you can. And I think those presidents, those chancellors that could put the ego on side with regards to their position on that in that board meeting and involve everyone into those conversations is going to end up in a much better situation.
I could not agree more. And that's the reason I started this certificate program at Penn for senior campus leaders about how to manage and provide good oversight of college athletics. It's not just the athletic director's job. It's not just the president's job. It should be the entire senior team helping an institution make decisions about the challenges that we have in athletics right now, the opportunities that might present themselves with changing conferences or maybe even changing divisions. Those need more than one set of eyes on their decisions. So involving more good thinkers would seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, Karen, you mentioned that you've seen more presidents involved with the athletic side of the equation.
Yep.
And my take on that is that during COVID, everyone was challenged to be involved with operational sides of the business that they maybe didn't necessarily pay attention to because we were in such a crisis mode that everything was extremely important. Athletics rose to such a high level of importance with regards to, are we able to even conduct them? What's the ROI on these programs? How do we handle safety for our student athletes and our coaches and all the individuals that are involved? What does the audience participation look like? So presidents dove right into that challenge head on. And coming out of it, they said, wait a minute, there's a big part of my operation that some of them actually got passionate about it, right? They really learned and how to get involved with it. But that trend is not going to go away anytime fast. I mean, that's clearly, everyone is sitting back and saying, if you had to go through COVID by yourself, you are going to be a lonely person because that's not the way most people got through it. And no one wants to go back that way.
Yeah. Adrian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I want to go back to a question you asked about kind of strategy and any alignment with the president's, the president's vision versus the board's vision. And I think that alignment is key, right? That everybody's on the same page. I mean, I think Dave and I've seen challenges arise when there's not, right? For so many of these smaller schools, I mean, athletics is not a strategy. It's not a savior that I think many senior leaders might hope it is, but I think Dave is right. I mean, COVID did bring everybody together. It gave an opportunity for a lot of senior leaders to take a closer look at a lot of things, right? To get smarter about a lot of things. But I think just, again, going back to what Dave is saying, it's that alignment. It's that relationship between senior leadership, whether or not that's inclusive of the board or not, just to make sure that they're all on the same page, because that's where we're seeing some challenges. In that misalignment.
So one of the things we talked about a little while ago was that Baker Tilly often works with schools that have been approached or are considering changing either divisions or conferences and making a huge move. It could be Division 1 to 3, or it could be Division 2 to 1. What pieces of advice do you have for presidents if they are somehow being arm twisted into making that kind of move for their athletics program?
It's a great question, Karen. And I think it goes back to one, really confirming the understanding of the question. What's being asked? What's driving the strategy? Is there alignment between all of the key decision makers? And then again, getting really smart about it, looking at the data, understanding what the conference requirements are, if there are any penalties for moving, even having a really basic understanding of what your team budgets are. I think sometimes, being in the accounting world, we're sometimes surprised when we go in and say, okay, well, give us your cost analysis for your teams. What are your revenues? What are your expenses? We don't know. Oh, okay. Well, let's start there. Let's take a look at, actual costs. Let's help you project out. Okay, so you're thinking about moving all into D1, or you're thinking about moving, all into D3, or you want to expand teams. You want to have an opportunity to bring more students in because, a lot of the work that we've done in this area, I'm sure you have too, is demonstrated that, athletics is really good for retention and persistence, right? So how do we, and for recruitment of, more diverse groups. So not only how do we get more people and how do we keep them and help them through to graduation? Well, what are some teams that we can offer? Okay, well, there's rules to that. What are the Title IX considerations that we need to be aware of? What are the equity considerations? What are the capital considerations? So, do we have existing facilities that could be leveraged to bring in, new sports? Do we have the scheduling permissibility and the tools to do all that? Do we have the teams? Do we have the market permission? Right? Will we be successful if we start to go down this path? Because it all comes back to reputation too. You don't want to start a program and then, not be known positively in the marketplace. Are you in a market saturated area with this particular, sport? Can we get a coach? What does the pipeline look like? So it's all about really spending the time with the data, asking the questions, again, back to what Dave was saying, having the right people in the room, bringing them together to have that really good, that collaboration, that groupthink. All good questions, and definitely I think as budgets continue to get tighter for a lot of schools, questions that are going to continue to be asked.
Yeah, I get asked them all the time. Dave, how about you? What kinds of thoughts are you hearing in this area?
Yeah, well, it's hard to follow Adrian's assessment that she just gave. So that's a 101 in assessing your athletic program. So at the end of that process, here's what I'll add to that conversation: is that it's a calculated risk sometimes. No matter how much the data supports you, no matter where you're at, there's going to be variables, and it becomes a calculated risk. In my view, you cannot just stand in the middle of the road and contemplate it. You have to make a decision at some point. So use it the best you can with regards to the information you have in front of you. Do your homework, surround yourselves with the experts, but at the end of the day, have the courage to make a decision. Otherwise, everybody is in limbo, and you really, really have a tough position, because once you go down this path, everyone starts to wonder where you're going to end up. And there's not always winners in the equation. There could be people on both sides, and you cannot leave your population in a position where they're creating their own end story. You have to act in these situations.
And you've worked with institutions I know who have moved from Division II to Division I, or were merging. And as you look back on that process and where they are today, what do you think they've done well? I'm not going to ask you to name them. What do you think they've done well in the process?
Yeah, so there's some really good examples of institutions that have done all the right things with regards to communication, transparency, engagement of the population, making the hard decisions, making the calculated risk, and going down that path. I will tell you, the number one thing that I think is often overlooked in any of these critical decisions and these transformations is setting realistic expectations, right? No matter what you do when you go through a transformational change, more than likely, you're going to step backwards before you ever go forwards. And it could be a 2 to 3 year process before you start seeing the benefits. Everyone likes to believe that the hard work is up front, creating the strategy, getting things changed, getting the buy-in from the stakeholders. That is definitely a difficult part of the process. But the real hard work starts when you start initiated after you made your decision. And then the little things that pop up with regards to things that you never even thought about. They are the challenges that they exist at the ground level. That's where it makes and breaks you. So to think that the hard work is over after you made the decision is probably one of those things that you don't set as a realistic expectation for you or your team.
It's a good point. It's a good point. One of the things that I see when I talk to presidents who have come in, maybe a decision was made about their athletic positioning 20 years ago, and the landscape has shifted around them dramatically, whether it's the other schools around them who are their peer institutions have made moves, or the board doesn't look the same as it did 20 years ago when their advice was to go there. And now they feel stuck. Now they feel like, well, we can't leave this conference now or this division now because that's part of our brand. That's who we are. But they're struggling. You can tell that they can't win in a lot of sports unless they're in a very unique conference that focuses on those sports. What do you do if you're a president in that position? What do you do? Do you take the risk yourself to maybe start having the conversations? Maybe this isn't where we fit anymore. Or do you just kind of say, well, that's not my problem, and I move on to something else?
Well, that's definitely not the attitude that we take care of Baker Tilly, right? We're always going to challenge our clients. So Adrian said it best, right? With regards to really being able to challenge yourself and having that realistic viewpoint, looking in the mirror and just saying to yourself, here's where I am in this particular part of our journey. But more importantly, Adrian also mentioned the fact that we're in an environment where change is more acceptable than ever, right? We are doing things that we never thought we would do before. We could all give credit to COVID if we want to give credit to that being the big disruptor, but no one should be afraid of making transformational changes in this environment. I would think it's more than acceptable and expected with regards to a culture of innovation. So schools and leadership, no one should ever be surprised when you come to a conference or come to a conversation and someone says, hey, I'm going to do this. We're like, all right, great. How can we help you? Because nothing should shock us in this current environment.
Interesting. Adrian, in terms of innovation, I know you pay close attention to what campuses are doing. What kinds of innovation strategies maybe 2 or 3, would you recommend that our listeners consider in their leadership development?
I think, and it's a combination of building off of what Dave just talked about is, well, one, courage. I mean, I think that is, a key word, but also just what does the data say, right? What does the data say, regardless of what topic you're looking at. But if you're going to make a decision, don't be emotive and don't go off of, feelings and all of that great stuff, but really take time to look at the data and the trends and what that shows. And like Dave said, don't be deterred if you make a decision to stick with it, right? Even if you might have a one-off event. It's just so funny, thinking about March Madness and, you think about these Cinderella stories, and there may be a couple institutions in there that were thinking about doing something a little bit different. And then, they have a team that really performs well. Well, that's great. And that would be wonderful if that, persists, but you still have to take a hard look at what the numbers say and not be afraid. Innovation, I think, some of the things that we're following, and this is very controversial in higher education, Dave, don't worry, I'm not going to say anything really, really crazy, is just this move towards, again, back to student-centered career pragmatists, understanding what students really want and how students are driving the program arrays and being really responsive to that. I think we see a lot of schools really struggling for a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of competing priorities, but I think that acknowledgement that we as institutions need to really be responsive and adapt to those student needs from an academic standpoint is something we're going to continue to follow. What does that look like in terms of how we develop programs and we push them out? Maybe what we sunset is going to be really interesting. I think something we also continue to follow, again, back to student needs on just everything else, the student experience is something we continue to follow, being aware that students just need a lot of help these days. It looks a little bit different. Today's student does not look like the student of 10 years ago, of 20 years ago. And I think that is a learning process for our faculty to take into account that, and we see this a lot in the STEM disciplines and in the medical disciplines, but just recognizing that your students' learning styles and, time to learn and comprehension and all of that stuff takes a little bit of a different path than it might have historically. But I think we as you know, faculty, as administrators need to adapt to that because this is our pipeline, right? So, you know, I think the two innovations I would say that we're watching is how the academic programming is being responsive, how agile it is to respond to student needs. And I would also just say the student support broadly, because for so many of our schools, our students are our lifelines. So we need to evolve to meet those needs.
It's a great point. Great point. My last question, of course, I have to ask it because it's March Madness, but let's say you're a Cinderella team, right? And you like your Florida Atlantic or your St. Peter's or some other team, and all of a sudden your alumni get really excited and they want something big to happen. You know, they want to, because they won these games, therefore the entire athletics program, the entire institution should be raised in the profile. And that doesn't always happen based on the research that economists have done. There's a bump, but there's not that great of a bump. But how do you ride it? If you've had a successful run, how do you ride it out so that you can maximize that exposure you've had?
It is, I love it, right? So, and there is a short-term win from it, right?
Yeah.
Literally. And I think people should maximize on that. But at the end of that, it's like having a great weekend get together with the family and a great birthday party. I'm not sure I want to do that every night, right? I want to get back to some of the basics principles in which I have in life, work and so forth, exercise and so forth. So I guess I say it this way, that if your strategy was to be a Cinderella team and your strategy was to win March Madness and you had a platform that was going to compel you once you executed on that strategy, then follow it through. But I think for the most part, if the donors and the alumni get excited and say, hey, we need to do this, as a leadership team, we need to have the courage to not only embrace the current situation, but educate those individuals on, wait a minute, that's great. We love our team. Let's focus on what we talked about last week. Here's our strategy. Here's the things that we as an institution said are important to us, and that doesn't change.
Right, right. Adrian, what are your thoughts?
Dave stole my thunder there. I love that you went. I was going to go root cause, right? Like what is it that drove you? So if you, to Dave's point, if you can drive it back to that was your strategy, that's great. Keep the course because you likely have the infrastructure, I think, to kind of continue along. Yeah. If not, I think take that positive PR, that the good vibes that are happening on campus, the good energy, and redirect it again to what you do well. You know, how can we use that to continue to bring good students to campus, to bring you know, good faculty to campus, to bring other outside programming to campus? How can we leverage that to again kind of pivot that back to what our, you know, our core reason for being is? So yeah, I think that's where I'd take it.
Yeah, and realize that again, the world has changed, and some of the athletes may put themselves in the transfer portal, and you might lose your coach to another school, and those things happen too. So it's really a very fluid, flexible dynamic that leaders have to navigate. Dave and Adrian, I'm so grateful. I really enjoyed this conversation to just talk about change, adaptation, and leadership wellness, and how to navigate both the good things and the not so good things that are happening in higher ed. Thank you.
We appreciate the opportunity. And I know today's all about the challenge. So Karen, if you have us back, we'll talk about all the opportunities on the next one. So
you got it. You got it. I would love to do that. Absolutely. It sounds good.
Thank you both.
Thank you.